You've heard of the economic crash, massive economic crash that happened in the early 20s. That was like bigger than the stock market crash in 1929.
No.
Yeah, and the government didn't do anything, and the stock market recovered very quickly.
You're suggesting that after 1929, if we hadn't gotten the New Deal, everything would have been fine.
I'm not saying everything would have been fine and it would have been difficult, but the New Deal, it's worth going back and looking at, how did the New Deal affect the economy, and did it string out bad times?
In this video, Jon Stewart goes head-to-head with Nick Gillespie using facts. So Gillespie kicks things off by claiming the markets just recovered just fine without government action after an early 20th century crash. And Stewart just immediately presses him, pointing out how absurd it is to suggest that the Great Depression could have been fixed without the New Deal. And from there, the debate just spirals into a showdown over whether government intervention saves economies or drags them down. So make sure to watch till the end to see how Jon Stewart goes head-to-head with Nick Gillespie using facts.
Because there are two economic depressions in the 30s that economists talk about, and that every government intervention has costs and benefits, and oftentimes we have lost sight of things.
Well, let's use a more a more recent example, which would be the 2008 financial crisis versus the pandemic.
Yeah.
In 2008 financial crisis, it's caused by risk-taking behavior within our investment economy.
And particularly, that was behavior that was heavily incentivized by the federal government in terms of guaranteeing mortgage loans and things like that. And
Freddie Mae and those guys got into the game pretty late. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to say that the hedge funds did it because they thought the government incentivized it.
No, I mean, but it was the Federal Reserve, first off, kept interest rates artificially low for a long time. And then the government had a policy of its, government-sponsored entities of buying up all of the mortgage paper that was going. So banks did not do the due diligence.
But they jumped into that later.
Everybody has, some schmutz on their hands from all of this. But
it's funny. I think you and I, I'm kind of interested in this because I think where you and I would like society to settle is probably almost the same place.
Absolutely.
I think you and I would look at it as, and here's my path to get there. And you would say, here's my path. And you've got to trust both of those paths. You got to go. And ultimately, you got to trust me.
Yeah.
Well, that's where it comes down to theology.
I would argue that it's also, we would probably agree on similar on a similar path.
Alright, so right here, Nick Gillespie is just trying to reframe history again. He shifts from the Depression to modern examples, saying the 2008 crash was basically the fault of government policy, cheap Fed money, and mortgage guarantees. He's really leaning into that libertarian spin where government money interference is the boogeyman. But Stewart jumps in and really grounds it, pointing out how the hedge funds and banks weren't just innocent bystanders tricked by policy, they were actively reckless and greedy. And this is where you can see Stewart's strength. He doesn't let Gillespie turn every failure into government bad. He reminds him that private actors have responsibility too, and that pretending they only misbehaved because of policy is just a dodge. And what's funny is Gillespie kind of admits that everybody's got schmutz on their hands, which basically undercuts his whole argument. Stewart exposes the contradiction right there.
Because I suspect, I was looking this up beforehand. Mm-hmm. In 2001, which was Bill Clinton's final budget year as president, he left office in 2000 or early 2001, fiscal year lasts a little bit longer. He spent less than $2 trillion there. That was the entire federal budget. We are over $7 trillion now. In 2019, the year before COVID, we were spending $4.4 trillion a year. That went up to $6.6 trillion in 2020. It is now $7.2 trillion in spending. And I suspect that you would agree with me that we should not be, it's not clear why we're spending $7.2 trillion.
Well, I certainly don't think we're spending it effectively. I think that's for sure.
But like, why at all? Like, how do you go from, we're post-COVID.
So here's what I would say with that. There are different ways to stimulate the economy. So I think since Reagan, and probably before that, probably Carter, there has been the idea that supply side, sort of what they would call neoliberal policy, is the best way to stimulate the economy, which means that the money, tax cuts for incentivizing wealthier people and corporations and allowing for more M&A and allowing for consolidation within industries, which in some ways, these really, it's the rise of these gigantic multinational corporations. And it gets back to sort of what we're talking about in 2008 versus the pandemic. In 2008, the crash came from the financialization of all these products. It came from the white collar markets. We bailed them out as taxpayers,
which I would totally against that. And,
as was I.
Yeah,
but not against bailing out homeowners. That's maybe where you and I would differ.
It depends, but yeah.
But in the pandemic, when the era that rent assistance went out and the $600, the stimmy went out, what it showed to me was it took us 10 years. It took us a decade after 2008 to even get back to a semblance of where we were. The pandemic, it took us a year or a year and a half financially to be back. What it says is, in my mind, direct stimulus at a demand side level is far more fiscally responsible than these trickle down neoliberal policies. I think we can spend less and get more.
We can definitely be more effective in intervening in economic, situations. I don't think part of the government's role should be like, hey, you know what? It's not like going to a personal trainer and you come in and they're like, hey, you're looking a little fat. Let's do some abs today, and have the government constantly be smoothing the economy. Or I think it's hubris to think that it can control things. It's one thing when you have a catastrophic adventure.
But isn't it to prevent more catastrophic adventure at some level?
Well, this is where,
this is where the theology comes in.
No, but it's also like, remember, in the early 2000s, we had the tech bubble crash.
Yes.
And then we had a bunch of, accounting rules that were going to make sure that, the financial sector never fucked around with shit anymore. Then, the financial crisis hits. I would argue, is largely because of government actions, or is heavily abetted by government actions, as well as greed and
But don't
whatnot.
you think those actions were all influenced by the lobbyists from the finance?
So here Gillespie just leans on this big government spending narrative, pointing out how the federal budget ballooned from around $2 trillion in Clinton's last year to over $7 trillion today. He frames it like, why are we even spending this much at all? And that's just classic libertarian framing, equating growth in government spending with inefficiency. But Stewart's response is what really lands. He highlights how supply-sided neoliberal policies, tax cuts for the wealthy, corporation consolidations, all that Reagan to Clinton lineage created fragility in the system. And he nails Gillespie by comparing 2008 to the pandemic. In 2008, we spent years propping up banks and financial institutions while average people got crumbs. Contrast that with the pandemic, where direct checks and rent assistance meant the economy bounced back in a year and a half instead of a decade. That's a concrete win for demand-side stimulus, and it undercuts Gillespie's whole government always screws up argument.
When the government sets out to do something smart, that gets watered down almost immediately by the moneyed interests.
This is, public choice economics talks about how, like, we think people want to think of the government as acting somehow differently than the private sector, but
Right.
It's oftentimes completely captured by the interests that it's supposed to regulate, or it is also just trying to build its own empire. So it's going to try and regulate more and more stuff.
So is the idea, Nick, if we were to boil this down, let me ask you this. Is the idea maybe that's fundamental to our disagreement that because government can be captured by the same corrupt and corrosive interests that maybe business can be captured by. And I remember having Greenspan on the show and saying, why did we have a crisis in 2008? And he said, well, I think we thought that the banks would have done a better job of regulating themselves. And I was like, well, yeah, I didn't. Yeah. But the point being, is the only way to prevent that to remove government? Is that your sort of foundational principle?
Not necessarily remove it completely, but minimize its attempt to rig the system in favor of particular outcomes, whether that's for the little guy or the big guy or whatever.
And let the natural order, and that you don't fear the natural order will be that the little guy's got no chance against money.
Yeah, I don't, and I say this again, this is coming from, my father was born in Hell's Kitchen in the 1920s. He did okay. I did much better than him. What I'm getting at is the idea that I actually think that capitalism offers more opportunities specifically for people to rise up from the, the lower classes and the middle classes.
You mean as opposed to communism or socialism?
Or like, a super regulated market where you're only getting into schools because of, what family you come from and all of this kind of stuff.
Which is still a large part of the operating system that we work
absolutely.
with.
No. And nothing is perfect, right? Nothing is perfect. But, we came out of the financial crisis with, now we know we're not going to do anything too big to fail, right? And it's like, in fact, the financial industry, the financial sector is more, is more concentrated than it ever was. And everybody in it knows that, like, no, we're too big to fail, which also means we can fuck around and find out how bad.
That's right.
So what I'm saying
just watch us.
Yeah, the government, it is a very tricky thing. And once you start thinking like, okay, the government can control stuff and make good outcomes, like it does until, you realize, this was a big catastrophe. And I think with something like the COVID stuff, when we're talking about, there's economic issues which are worth talking about. And I think, the massive increasing and extending of unemployment benefits was really bad. And it's generated so much debt that is going to, that's not going away, even if like the annual GDP growth is increasing and things like that. There were so many interventions into the economy where if the government had done smaller targeted things for shorter times, I think we would be better off.
Well, I think they were also not practiced with demand side stimulus. And so maybe they just didn't understand quite what the real value of it was, because the amount of economic activity it generated, even with wrecked supply chains.
So wrapping this up, it's clear that Jon Stewart was clearly pushing with more facts and logic, while Nick Gillespie just kept circling back to the same libertarian talking points. Stewart just exposed how lobbyists and corporations bend government to their will, and while Gillespie just tries to spin that into proof that the government itself is the problem. One side was grounded in history and results, and the other in ideology and what-ifs. And when you strip it all down, Gillespie's framing is really just bias dressed up as economic wisdom. And speaking of bias...
Are you getting tired of getting news from biased news sources? One outlet says one thing and another says the complete opposite? How are you supposed to know what's actually true? That's where ground news comes in. It lets you compare how different media outlets, whether it's left, right, or center, are covering the same story, so you can see the full picture instead of just the echo chamber. And here's the best part. Click the link in the description and get a 40% off the Vantage tier, which gives you even deeper insights in media bias and political trends. So stay informed, think for yourself, and check out ground news in the description down below.